Welcome to the latest episode of Talking Global Infrastructure. I'm Vlad Benn, Research Lead at the Global Infrastructure Investor Association. Today I'm joined by Kate McKeon of Infrared and Joe Robinson of Equitix to discuss environmental, social, governance considerations for infrastructure investors, which have given rise to an acronym I'm sure many of us are familiar with, ESG. Hi both, thanks for joining.
Hi Vlad, great to be here.
Hi Vlad.
So the past 2 years have seen a number of landmark sustainability-linked global agreements. We've had COP26, which concluded in Glasgow and agreed to keep the global warming target of 1.5 degrees alive and finalised the outstanding elements of the Paris Agreement. There's also the new Global Biodiversity framework arising from the COP15 conference in Montreal, setting out expectations for investors when it comes to protecting natural habitats and ecosystems. However, geopolitics has shifted, placing more emphasis on energy security in Europe as a result of a recent supply crisis, and ESG has ignited debate amongst US politicians. Joe, what do we make of this, and how will it impact ESG considerations in investment decisions here in Europe?
Sure. Look, Vlad, I think it's very clear that it's a complex environment when it comes to environmental, social governance considerations in financial services, and of course, more specifically for us within infrastructure investment. These are very complex challenges, and the global frameworks and alphabet soup of acronyms that are really, I believe, at this stage defining what it is when we sort of speak about ESG are requiring ever more resource, I think specialized skills and appropriate background in understanding how do these macro sustainability challenges translate into actionable work for fund managers, for lenders, for anyone in sort of business today. And what we've seen is really the emergence of various regulatory frameworks. We are required increasingly to define, to disclose, to report, to demonstrate evidence around what it is we do on this topic of ESG. And I think particularly in the infrastructure space, investors with that longer term buy and hold strategy, the time horizon that many investors in infrastructure look to, are much more aware now of the signals that these global frameworks, these policies, the regulations and the legislation that flows from those mean when it comes to investing in real assets, and that it is no longer the case that a net zero target set at sort of nation state level can be ignored as an instrument that purely sits in the political sphere and has no then knock-on effects to business and to finance. So I think there is a much closer scrutiny of what is going on in the world, and as you mentioned, the fact that there is discourse and there is debate, and that not every jurisdiction has the same view or background when it comes to what that policy or regulatory or legislative environment looks like. And so in addition to those complex real-world macro sustainability challenges, there is also the ability to navigate and to find direction in a quite noisy background and backdrop that separates perhaps the European, the UK, and the US approaches amongst all the other countries and regions in the world as being quite distinct and not always cohesive.
Brilliant. Thanks, Joe. And Kate, where do you see the key challenges and opportunities? It's now been almost 2 years since COP26. Are approaches moving on from pure compliance with regulation?
Yeah, sure thing. So for me, I think it's always really easy to jump straight into the question of compliance, particularly when we're talking about all these emerging sustainability regulations that, Joe's just mentioned. But I think it might make sense to take a bit of a step backwards and focus on, what are the purpose of these regulations? And in most instances, I would say this kind of boils down to the assessment and management of sustainability impacts. And I think this is an area where the industry has gotten much more sophisticated in recent years. So, the example I would use is how, we're assessing the sustainability considerations of new investments. So, a few years ago, and, guilty as charged, I was on our origination execution team then, but I would say ESG due diligence most likely would have involved, a quick review of health and safety processes, and probably assessment around the planning, consents and approvals and the conditions there. Whereas you move to today, and it's really not uncommon for due diligence of a new investment to include physical climate risk assessment, traceability audits to assess human rights issues, considerations of biodiversity impacts, just to name a few. So not only are we covering a much wider breadth of topics, we are also due diligencing these issues to a much greater depth than we used to. And I think that's evidenced by the ESG DD services and capabilities we've seen develop within the consulting market. So from my perspective, I think the industry has already evolved in terms of how we assess these key sustainability issues. And I think that's kind of, regardless of irrespective of the regulatory environment. But I think the really interesting part is what the regulatory environment has added to this is, in my perspective, is probably around kind of two key areas. So I think firstly, the regulations require managers to pull the whole story together. So, for example, the regulations require managers to disclose which ESG risks are relevant for a particular fund and explain how they have been assessed for the underlying investments in order to understand any potential risks at the overall fund level. And then I think the second key part is that the regulations require the assessment process to be backed up with key ESG metrics and targets. And this really required the industry to move from what was historically one where outputs were reported predominantly on a qualitative basis to one where all managers have to report quantitative metrics on a consistent basis across the industry. So I think this is obviously a really positive outcome for the industry, but I will caveat that with I think one of the key challenges still is around ensuring these requirements of the regulations, and Joe's touched on the regulations in different jurisdictions, but we need to kind of make sure that they don't become too onerous such that we lose sight of where the real ESG value can be generated.
Yeah, and I think to add to that, there is an element here where no regulatory framework will be able to capture the asset class nuances across multiple different strategies. And so in the alternative space with sort of private unlisted infrastructure, there is a degree of complexity in the assets and the underlying sectors and the sorts of investments that are being made that will not be shared across other investment strategies. And clearly, there is an ability to set a wide framework that's quite high level. It touches on macro issues, as Kate describes, related to reporting and to disclosure and general standards of good practice. But I think it's also the case that the market over the past sort of 18 or 24 months has gone through quite a difficult exercise in trying to fit certain frameworks or standards that may be very easily implementable elsewhere into the context of infrastructure. And I think a common theme for infrastructure investors is that we are not always looking to invest in an infrastructure business or platform. It's an operational asset. It might be a network of assets. It could be a single point. It could be a school. It could be an energy from waste plant. It could be a port. There are a whole variety of differences there in terms of what the underlying asset is doing. And I think it's really on industry now to set about what materiality sort of frameworks are implemented to help navigate through and not layer in considerations that are irrelevant or immaterial to the asset, but as kind of Kate alluded to really double down on those areas where the ESG or the sustainability considerations matter most. And I think that's where we will be able to sort of drive this next evolution, let's say, in we've got that alignment with the regulatory frameworks. That's sort of our baseline. And in doing so, as Kate describes, there's been a lot of evolution in the market in terms of how ESG as a toolkit is applied. But now it is really kind of keeping that firm presence in mind of what it means to be a long-term fiduciary investor and how ESG as a toolkit is supportive of that aim and where it can be best applied for maximum impact in terms of understanding not just the risks to financial returns, but also the wider positive benefits that can be derived from the investments that we are making from an environmental or a social perspective too.
And so why are these ESG considerations so crucial?
I think if I was to start on the criticality of these ESG data points, it's important to make sure that the discussion that we have as an industry really focuses in on the fact that today the market recognizes, along with regulators, that specific environmental and social issues for certain assets over the long term may present some form of financial risk or opportunity to improve and enhance value. And that as a long-term responsible investor, I think many fund managers would agree that incorporating those risks and opportunity drivers into the overall risk management framework and the value creation framework for a particular fund is going to be, in the long term, more beneficial to LPs than disregarding or trying to paint as something being political or sort of irrelevant to those fiduciary duties. And I think that this ESG sort of framework, as it has evolved through the regulations, through best practices, is really part and parcel of that long-term investment approach, and it's not a separate exercise that should be considered additional to those kind of sustainability impacts that arise. I mean, perhaps that is a more complex and nuanced question, but from a starting point, applying a robust ESG framework into the investment lifecycle, I think is something that is here to stay and is here to become really firmly business as usual for long-term investors.
Yeah, and I was just going to add to that. I think it's quite interesting when you consider how we've kind of evolved and how we've been kind of monitoring ESG considerations across portfolios. So, I mentioned before around where it was quite qualitative, but I think we were kind of more focused around, the governance piece in terms of, do you have these policies and processes in place for, how you're driving kind of ESG performance within a portfolio company. And I think where, the regulations is moving managers is to be more sophisticated, to say, ask those kind of follow-up questions to say, well, demonstrate that those policies and procedures are actually leading to action that are driving, either positive impacts or mitigating the potential for ESG risks. So I think, again, that's kind of just pulling that real sophistication out, that it's less of, big picture, what do you say you do? It's actually, what are you doing and delivering on in terms of those tangible actions?
Great. And so we've talked about the reporting requirements around ESG. How do you strike the right balance between meeting those requirements and delivering action, delivering investment?
I think it's really interesting and certainly a live topic for many of us, because I think it is absolutely important we have a consistent approach to ESG data in terms of what we mean by those data points, how we collect those data points, how we then interpret and use those data points for reporting and disclosure, as well as internally in terms of understanding how an asset or a particular sector we are invested in benchmarks and sort of performs. I think that clearly there needs to be a very sort of careful approach in terms of how much then is dedicated just simply reporting that information versus how much can be actioned and utilized, as Kate describes, in terms of improving positive performance over the long term. And part of this is an education piece, I believe, between general managers, sort of general partners, and ourselves in terms of how we look at the funds, how we look at the assets, and we try to better understand our assets and how they operate and where there can be improvements from a sort of cost reductions perspective or a emissions reductions perspective, whichever issue is most material. And I think there's also an education piece to the sort of LP market and to lenders in terms of how then that information is utilized by those stakeholders and how they're able to better understand the ways in which sort of the asset owners, as it were, the beneficiaries of capitals that's been sort of put into these funds, can really understand their exposure to certain ESG issues and where they want to prioritize action over the long term. So I think we're very much in a learning stage still. We've got plenty of processes in place, and there are plenty of software providers, consultants who are sort of certainly piling into the market in terms of how do we really make this come alive, and how do we execute on these strategies. And I think it's going to be interesting to see, looking ahead, how that then starts to formalize into more consistent industry standards around what it is we choose to report, how we present that information, how do we define these data points, and how do we really make this work as an additional part of our ESG strategy and not the strategy in and of itself.
So I completely agree with Joe on this point. And we've probably spoken a lot about reporting and data before, but I honestly just don't think there's any getting away from it at the moment. I think it is, right now it's fundamentally a core component of sustainability. That it's a necessity to respond to kind of the evolving regulatory environment and to respond to kind of investor expectations. I think as well that having kind of experienced firsthand the difficulties of capturing this data from portfolio companies, I do have a lot of sympathy for our LPs, because they're obviously sitting that one step further removed from the investments. And I'm conscious that a lot of our investors are captured by the same ESG regulations that we are, so they're just trying to comply with their requirements. But in addition, they also want this information to ensure that their investments are being managed in a responsible way, and that they ultimately have to say that back to their beneficiaries. I do sadly think there's still, a lot of work that still needs to be done around kind of data management and reporting. And so, but I generally do think that there will be a shift away of the resource requirements that's allocated to this in the next couple of years, as as kind of Joe's mentioned around the data management tools, and as that kind of gets bedded into our processes, I think this will run a lot more smoothly, and that frees that resource up to kind of get back to driving, the ESG performance and where the real value is. I think the only other point I think is worthwhile noting here is that it is still indirectly driving ESG performance as we kind of move to that more quantitative data. We sit at asset managers, financial metrics is our kind of, bread and butter. And all of a sudden, when you start putting forward really quantitative ESG measures, you have people naturally just saying, well, what does this number mean? Or why is this number going up compared to last year? Or why is my energy consumption for this portfolio company double that of this one? That doesn't make sense. So there is an aspect where, even though kind of a lot of time and attention is being focused towards getting that data to meet the reporting requirements by pure nature of analyzing and assessing that data, that is kind of ultimately leading back to actions in terms of understanding where the ESG performance may not be where we expect it to be. So it is already kind of happening, but I'm already excited for the position in a few years' time once it's a bit more bedded into our processes, and it's a hygiene factor as opposed to a predominant focus of sustainability.
And I think, Kate, just sort of finishing that point from my perspective, I think there's something here whereby, despite the fact that this is challenging and it does take up a lot of time, and that developing a kind of clear, robust data set is, I think, for many funds, a key aspect of what ESG integration is all about currently. What it has invited is much more in-depth discussion about what underlies those data points. And I think that is a healthy and very productive use of time. It has invited, I think, much more scrutiny of not just how do we collect that information, but what does it really mean? And whether, as you mentioned, it's about sort of understanding why a certain data point perhaps fluctuates, or trends in a certain direction that doesn't sort of appear to be consistent with expectation. It's also a sort of deeper layer whereby, in order to make this work, so much engagement with a wide set of stakeholders is and has already been necessary, that we are starting to kind of see the right conversations happening in terms of not just how do we go about collecting the data, but what does this then tell us about that asset that brings new information to light, or joins dots together in terms of, does our energy sort of efficiency align with operating costs for that asset. It's a very sort of simple comparison, but that is kind of extended across a much wider range of data points now, which I think is a positive step forwards. And it means that more of us are being educated about the underlying numbers on ESG, and it's not sat just with some dedicated individuals at funds. It forces engagement with all kind of key stakeholders involved in these assets and portfolio companies, which I think is a positive for the industry.
No, I think that's a really good point, isn't it? Because I guess we're thinking about going to our portfolio companies for this information, but in turn, they're going to their subcontractors for that information, and indirectly, that's creating all that engagement. And I think definitely we've seen as we try and measure our kind of GHG emissions around people just getting up to speed around what does that mean, what is that driving, and as a result, all the indirect conversations that fall off that just data collection process is what we need to actually turn it into driving real initiatives. So it probably realistically is probably not as much of a distraction as it might seem on the surface of it when you think about all the different layers of people involved in terms of this data process and still implementing ESG aspects as part of their day-to-day role.
Great. Thanks, Kate. Look, investors are taking all of this data in, making disclosures. I wanted to ask about greenwashing too. What would your advice be to investors who are concerned about sharing updates on their ESG progress due to this label?
I think it's a very interesting and particularly pertinent question around how, following COP26, following the biodiversity COP, there is an immense amount of pressure on key actors within the financial system, within business, to start presenting some form of tangible action or commitment around these very important issues. And everyone is at a slightly different stage of their own evolution. Everyone has a slightly different perspective on materiality. Some may look at double materiality, both the impacts from a sustainability perspective as well as a financial one of these kind of macro sustainability issues. Some may only be interested in the financial materiality of these issues. There will be differing degrees in terms of the underlying portfolio companies and the assets and the sectors and the extent to which their diversity in approach will also impact the ways in which fund managers are able to then report and provide sort of concrete positions on particular issues. There is no sort of one size fits all. And I think that with that ever growing complexity of the situation, it is causing some to sort of step back and say, well, how do we create certainty from this when it's such a fast moving, complex environment through which to navigate? Taking a position on something and then realizing that actually that isn't the correct position, or that there isn't evidence, or there is more evidence that comes to light that changes the circumstances in which perhaps following that situation a different position would have been taken, creates a lot of uncertainty. And I feel for those who are trying to provide some form of certainty to their LPs, to lenders, to the wider market, because it isn't easy. Now, despite that, I think there are a few key elements to any sort of approach when it comes to avoiding greenwashing that should be in everyone's minds, and I think help navigate the situation more easily. And I think having clear evidence and descriptors of how your entire framework operates. How do you actually reach a certain number? How do you go about understanding the quantitative impacts of a particular investment from an environmental or social perspective, as Kate described earlier? How have you reached a point in which you've defined materiality and assessed a certain set of issues to be more relevant or pertinent to your particular business or LPs than others? How can you substantiate claims and ensure that what you are setting out to achieve has the right intention and is also backed up by deeper thought in terms of how you're going to get from A to B, not just the what, but the how, I think is really important. I think having those sorts of questions in mind help to mitigate the risk of saying or doing something that is then later found out to be stretching the truth or an inaccurate presentation of reality. And at the same time, I think it's important within the context of infrastructure to be aware of how many of the assets we are invested in are by very nature critical services. They are driving at the heart of sort of government policy, the direction of travel on health and social care, on renewable energy, on transportation. And so ensuring from that perspective, we keep in mind that we want to avoid significant harm whilst also encouraging and ensuring that long-term delivery of positive value to real people who interact with these real assets, I think is fundamental here. And despite the frameworks and that alphabet soup of acronyms, I think it is quite straightforward when it comes to applying a sensible view on what it is you should be saying, committing to, and striving for best practice on, and defining each of those in turn. And I think you will also be aware instinctively, by the very nature of your business, what it is you can't do, but can instead be more transparent on explaining to those relevant stakeholders the steps you will take in order to get from A to B, and to acknowledge the fact that there are challenges here, and those challenges are better acknowledged, defined, and ultimately then over time resolved than simply being hidden and sort of taken with some form of quick fix. I would say a few considerations that are relevant from the greenwashing perspective, and Kate, maybe you also have a view on that too.
I was gonna say I feel like you've covered all bases, Joe. No, I agree. I think it's been quite interesting to watch how the market's shifted and how they communicate on sustainability over the last couple of years. So gone are probably the really big bold statements or big bold commitments that were backed up with any substance. The obvious favorites were everything was carbon neutral, or carbon neutral products with no science behind it. And we're obviously now much more further evolved in our understanding of GHG emission accounting, etc. And then I think I agree with Joe in terms of it has been good in the way that it's moved people along so that they're a lot more honest and transparent in their disclosures. So I think from our from a perspective where it's important that companies are being really clear around what they have done, what they still want to do, where they want to get to, and how they're going to do that. So I think that's way more important than kind of a big bold statement. It's around the actual kind of delivery and the plan and the strategy behind that, and how that fits into probably a wider business context. I think there's an aspect of, we were talking previously about this concept now that's the alternative of greenwashing, of green hushing. So, people have been so kind of, scared by the risk of getting exposed by greenwashing that they are, if anything, communicating less on what they're doing from a sustainability perspective. So I think that kind of concerns me because, we did have that great momentum behind where everyone was heading. And, that's, a big part of this is, I always say this is such a complex issue, we're never going to solve it by ourselves. So I think, at the core of sustainability is around collaboration and sharing information and, sharing that best practice. So I'd hate to think that we shift the other way where, people are kind of being a lot more quieter around what they're doing because they don't want to stick their necks out and get exposed for greenwashing. And then that's, again, when it kind of comes back to being ambitious, that, we can't go back to a world with those big, bold statements with no substance behind them. But I think, for me, it's really around, we can still do that, and it's essential to do that if we need to move the mark. But it's, as Joe was saying, it was kind of companies need to kind of make sure that they've got the sufficient disclosures around any kind of targets or commitments they're making. So, it's around being really kind of clear around, your target setting process, any assumptions that you've made along the way, outlining those key actions you're taking to achieve those. And then again, for me, it's the really important part is not shying away from reporting your ongoing performance against those targets. And in particular, even when that, performance is not on track or it's going backwards, I think that's the key aspect where you can kind of still do this if you're being really open and honest with progress, and if progress hasn't gone as you had expected, why that was the case and what you were doing, what you're doing to address it. So for me, it all really comes back to that kind of transparency and really kind of clear and open communications.
Great. Thanks, Kate. Communication is key. I think that's what I take from that. And so, given how critical infrastructure is in this journey, how do we ensure that stakeholders are brought along with us, Kate?
Sure thing. So, we've spoken about quite a few different stakeholder groups throughout the session, and when you look at infrastructure projects, there's so many. When it cuts from our public sector clients to our investors to the financiers, as well as the supply chain of actually kind of delivering these initiatives. And I think for me, because we kind of said about awareness, but I guess from my experiences, what I've really found in most cases when you're dealing with all these groups, everyone's bought in, everyone gets the importance of sustainability. All our corporates have our own kind of ambitions and our commitments. We all kind of want to head in the same direction, and we all want to kind of deliver real positive changes. And particularly when it comes around kind of climate action, and net zero is kind of key in driving the sustainability journey at the moment. So I think for me, it's really around, the opportunity is how do we leverage that? So how do we leverage our individual corporate ambitions, and as well as taking into consideration the specific skill sets of each of the individual kind of stakeholder groups that we spoke about, and how do we kind of leverage that and work together to deliver tangible actions? And for that, and that could simply be doing a particular initiative on a particular investment, or working at a bigger scale to work out how, as an industry, we can kind of move forward on an industry perspective. So, and you've stolen the words out of my mouth, Vlad, but I think it does come down to communication. And I think I feel like I'm probably going to be a broken record now, but it's that willingness to be really open to sharing information. I think sustainability is so different to other aspects, across how the infrastructure business operates, that, we work quite transparently. We're pretty open in sharing information and lessons learned to use that for the better of the industry. And it's how do we kind of collaborate amongst those kind of cross industry sectors to develop real solutions to the common issues that we're all facing. So it's kind of, for me, it's like, how do we make that effective? And I think that's something, as I said, the group's really good at doing. And there's a number of different working groups or initiatives that are happening at the moment, and everyone's working really kind of transparently and collaborative in those sessions. I think the only other thing I would say is just that I think we all need to challenge ourselves to make sure that we keep our eye on the ultimate objective, because I think it's quite easy to sign up to some of these working groups or these collaborative sessions and talk and talk and talk, and ultimately, like, we need to kind of remember what the ultimate outcome is this engagement is supposed to be leading to those kind of tangible outcomes where we're kind of moving the mark forward on ESG.
I completely agree with that. And I think it is about embracing that challenge in order to find the right solutions, as we said right from the beginning, that really work well in the context of infrastructure. And I think I also agree that it really does depend on the industry driving those solutions, because infrastructure practitioners will understand the context of what it is we typically invest in best, and can take from other asset classes best practices that apply well and are transferable, but should also be driving the innovation and creative thinking around what works best in the context of a very unique asset class, and what can we deliver that really drives best value for the long term. And I think zooming out from that very operational and sort of strategic piece that Kate describes in terms of how to actually implement and to really drive the change on the ground, I think it's also important that within infrastructure we recognize the role that these assets are playing in those longer term sustainability trends, and to really embrace the criticality of each of the sectors that infrastructure typically encompasses, because we do touch on a whole range of different transitions, and we speak a lot from an industry and a sort of wider societal perspective around climate, around net zero. Quite rightly, it's an enormous pressing issue for humanity to really face and to drive solutions in improving our position on. But we also touch on infrastructure, on digital, on social and healthcare. We touch on all parts of policy, regulation, on demand for services that governments and communities are looking for ever better solutions on. And I think it's also important to recognize those characteristics within infrastructure and what it is we are actually doing, because that can then better help us understand those on the ground sort of infrastructure specific solutions we need to drive in order to push ESG integration and longer term sustainability in the investments that we make. And contextualizing, what makes most sense for a hospital asset or for an offshore wind farm, and really looking at the local solution that brings most benefit to investors, to public sector stakeholders, to the communities and the people who use and work on that infrastructure, I think is really important here. And it helps again to just distill down how these frameworks, these global commitments actually work in practice. And I think it's exciting to know that there is a real energy in infrastructure, I feel, with various fund managers, with lenders, with consultants, recognizing that challenge and recognizing the role that infrastructure has to play across a whole spectrum of sustainability topics. And I do think that we are working on some very important topics that are going to shape the way in which this industry underpins those transitions and presents the asset class as an incredibly attractive driver of those solutions, both financially in terms of returns to investors over the long term, as well as environmentally and socially to the communities who interact with that infrastructure in their daily lives.
Brilliant. Thank you, Kate and Joe. I think I've learned quite a lot from this discussion, and certainly know that infrastructure is critical to getting us to net zero to 2050 in a sustainable way. Wanted to say thank you for joining me on this podcast. It's been a great discussion, and to the listeners, we look forward to welcoming you on episode 10.